Thank you, Jay. So there is a visual aid which I'm trying to put in your hands rather than on the screen. I hope you can get a copy. I would like to thank the organizers of this conference. I've learned a tremendous amount already. What's interested me also is there are a number of points of contact between what I'm about to say and what various speakers, starting with Professor P. Senath on the first evening, have also said. It would take me, however, too long to make those connections, but hopefully some of you will hear echoes of what others have argued in the last 2 days. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make some, rather than reading a paper, I'm going to make some comments around, as you can see from the handout, 5 quotations which have to some extent interested and also inspired me in what they're saying. And I will diverge from them a bit, but I would be happy if there are questions about these thinkers or these statements to talk about them more as well. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to propose a concept. I'm not totally committed to this concept or to the name that I'm giving it, which is that of eco-sovereignty. And if someone has a better name, I'd love to adopt it. But it's what I've used so far to try to talk about not directly global justice, but something that a number of speakers here have mentioned over the last couple of days, and that is the nature of political power that is required to institutionalize a conception of global justice. That's going to be my topic today. And I think to discuss that, we're going to have to steer away from it a bit and talk about some other ideas, principally the notion of self-determination and what that consists of. And so what I'm going to suggest then is that to realize any conception of global justice, one will have to give it a local instantiation, and that will require new political institutions, or at least reformed and transformed ones, that provide substantially more self-determination than many peoples around the world have today. So let's look at the first quotation. I'll read it quickly by Hannah Arendt in her first book written in the 1940s. Human dignity needs a new guarantee, which can be found only in a new political principle, in a new law on earth, whose validity this time must comprehend the whole of humanity, while its power must remain strictly limited, rooted in and controlled by newly defined, typo, territorial entities. Now, I take it that this insight, if it is an insight, goes against the grain of almost all thinking about global justice in the last 2 generations. And for the following reason. What Arendt tries to do is she tries to combine a cosmopolitan notion, a cosmopolitan moral concept of, as she calls it here, human dignity, with a limited territorial conception of the political institutions required to realize this concept. And one thing that this suggests to me is that there's a kind of a gap in most discussions of global justice between 2 things with the 3rd element missing. So as I see it, and I've been thinking of this sort of way of putting it as I've listened to other people speak at this conference, there's a moral concept which Arendt is calling human dignity, or you could perhaps call it equal human worth, that applies to all persons globally. And there's our public policies having to do with poverty, education, ecological sustainability, and other matters that are designed to implement this moral principle, this moral concept. But the 3rd element, the one that Arendt refers to here, a political concept, a political principle as she calls it, is what links the prior 2 elements. It's what links a moral conception with the public policies designed to realize that moral conception. And if you cannot come up with a political means or vehicle for doing this, then your moral concepts will find no realization, no actualization in the world as we know it. So the insight, I think, is in part that a concept of global justice is not equivalent to a political principle of this type, but it must include some such thing. It must provide us with a realistic conception of political agency and activity and action that we can use to embody or institutionalize whatever moral conception of equal dignity or humanity that we have. And absent that, we may have to revisit the moral concept that we have and question whether in fact it's a viable one. I would, I guess, add, maybe it's an obvious point, that I think that a number of views of global justice, including some that we've heard at this conference, lack this political element, and I would perhaps remind some of you that this point has been made by others so far. So that's what I want to focus on. The second element that probably to note about the principle by Arendt is that, of course, she refers to a territorial, limited, rooted conception of what political action must be. Now, this is, of course, embedded in her view about what political action is, which I cannot speak about, but I think that the larger point is not tied to her particular philosophy. It's simply that political action is, to put it bluntly and perhaps oversimplify, always local, or it must always in the end be local. And this is going to, of course, lead to some questions such as the one that Danilo Zolo raises in the third quotation, so I'll come back to this point. So at this moment then, I'm going to boldly go where it seems most haven't gone before, I hope with some productive results, and suggest what a new political principle will be. And that's what I'm calling eco-sovereignty. So I want to give you a basic definition. It's not on this sheet, but I will state it and then repeat it. Eco-sovereignty means the following: that regions or countries that embody a distinct and sustainable relation to their environment may claim sovereignty rights if this relation is threatened by states, corporations, or international institutions. Let me repeat that. Regions and countries that embody a distinct and sustainable relation to their environment may claim sovereignty rights if this relation is threatened by other agencies or other institutions. Now, what is involved in claiming sovereignty rights, we can talk about more later, but I want to suggest this as an ethical and normative principle. I am not describing a situation that it does exist. I'm trying to describe a situation that may exist and that I actually believe is coming into formation around us. Now, justifying this principle would take a bit more effort or time than I have, but I want to just highlight a couple of things about it. One is that sovereignty itself is not a foundational political principle, which is why I started talking about self-determination. So self-determination of peoples is a principle recognized for decades now in international law, but of course much of the commentary on this principle notes quite readily or quite truly that what a people is that is able to claim self-determination is left unspecified in many legal documents, legal instruments. And so there's been a lot of fighting about what exactly a people is that could claim such a thing. And in some of the quotations below, I refer to some theories about what a people could be, and I suggest that the definition of a people is similar to the one just given, that a people is a group of persons with a distinct relationship in a particular place to an environment. And I guess I probably needn't say that this particular relation, I think, is underserved if acknowledged at all by international law, and that in some ways I believe to be an agenda for the future. And I'll talk about what that means if I have time a little bit later. The second thing I guess I would say is that the underlying desideratum of eco-sovereignty is not only self-determination, but perhaps it wouldn't hurt to say what that itself is, and that is the notion fundamentally of freedom and of collective freedom. So much discussion about global justice, and I think partly rightly so, engages in various sorts of comparisons about states of life or states of affairs, including income, wealth, and other things, having to do with individual persons on a globally comparable basis. And self-determination does not directly address that issue. Rather, it suggests there's another value, another norm that should be present in global ethics and in international relations, and that is a norm that allows people to make collective decisions and enact those decisions through policies. Now, that might seem an obvious point, but I think it becomes less obvious, as I suggested, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, if you realize that most conceptions of global justice don't address this issue at all, as far as I can see, or rather they leave it to the future to come up with political institutions that can, in fact, provide people with the opportunity to do this. Finally, I think that I want to address very quickly how would this conceptualization change our understanding of what global justice might be, and I'm going to repeat myself a little bit here. 3 points. First, it's going to ultimately, I think, exclude or at least call into question concepts that seem to lack any possible political instantiation. Let me just sort of controversially mention a possible definition of what global justice might be that might do this. if you consider global justice to mean something like the following: the global equalization of incomes and resources of all individual persons on the planet. Personally, I cannot conceive of a political institution that is going to achieve this, certainly not in our lifetime, if ever. And what that suggests is that as a moral concept, such an idea might be laudable in all sorts of ways. But what it lacks is any political instantiation, and I think that should make us revisit such an idea. Secondly, this does not mean that the cosmopolitan affirmation of such things as equal human worth are called into question. In fact, as you noticed, Arendt affirms such an idea. But what it does mean is that such an idea, such a moral concept, must find realization by particular persons as members of particular political bodies, collective bodies, institutions, or entities. And that's partly the purpose of the principle that I'm putting forward. The idea is that, to use some phrases or conceptions, for people to have dignity, as Arendt puts it, for them to feel no shame in public, for them, in another formulation not used at this conference, to be recognized in terms of their own personhood and otherwise. These ways of conceiving the moral content of global justice for Arendt and for myself can only achieve purchase within a particular political context and a particular place on the planet. Now, a longer discussion would connect this to Arendt's view of human rights itself, in which, as I read her, there is only one human right, as she famously called it, the right to have rights. But this is a side issue which we can't go into here. Third comment before I go on to other quotations. What this is going to also mean, I think, is that it's going to make it a lot easier to define injustice and begin to try to address problems of injustice than to come up with an ideal or perfect conception of justice itself. And the previous speaker already raised some questions about this notion of perfect justice, with which I agree. And so it's going to make the notion of global justice more negative than positive, more a matter of ending or resisting takings that are coercive of things that people already possess, and it's going to make it defensive. And I think here it's, though it's by no means a complete accounting, that a notion of global injustice must include many of the things that people have mentioned at this conference, most particularly the processes of economic globalization, which I take it is simply a restatement in our own time of what Marx called primitive accumulation, the creation of capital through the taking of things that people have and that they're tied to. Now, such a notion may not only be defensive, it may also in some ways be recuperative. For instance, in situations, perhaps some of the wealthier countries, such as the United States, where a certain way of life or certain resources have been lost, part of this view may be about recovering them. But I think it's important to say that in places such as we are right now in South Asia and in India particularly, and in other parts of the global South, that such a notion of injustice is largely a matter of something that can still be stopped, that does not yet exist. And though I do not have the specifics with me, I noticed some fascinating data right before I came here, which indicates that South Asia and India in particular is the first in the world, the first region in the world in terms of a place that is still able to meet most food needs by local production. No other region of the world comes close to South Asia in its ability to do this. And when P. Senath said that, his wonderful comment that when he first heard of farmers markets, he said, "What's that? I thought all markets were farmers markets." I live in a place in the world where that's, as he noted, no longer true. It seems to still be largely true here. And that's something that's worth fighting for and defending. And what I'm trying to say is to provide a concept that justifies such actions. Now, that being said, I want to move on to the second quotation very quickly. There's a lot that could be said about it. But what I want to do now is I want to say, in terms of the second, third, and fourth passages on your handout, that these provide alternatives to eco-sovereignty, which I want to criticize, and then to the extent that I have time, I want to say a few things about Robin Eckersley's similar definition of it at the end. So Rawls says, in working out the law of peoples, a government as the political organization of its people is not the author of all its own powers. We must reformulate the powers of sovereignty in light of a reasonable law of peoples and deny to states the traditional rights to war and to unrestricted internal autonomy. Well, of course, I endorse the rethinking of the notion of sovereignty, which Rawls states here, and which I take to be consistent with Arendt's view. I don't think Rawls' view is sufficient for my purposes and for perhaps our purposes, but he does make an important point that's been made by others, and that is that states as such do not have legitimacy as sovereign entities. This is the idea that they do is sometimes, and has been called here, the Westphalian notion, and Rawls and others and myself are critical of this notion. That being said, and he gives you reasons, and I don't need to rehearse them, I think. That being said, what Rawls does not do is to provide an alternative conception of how a popular or people's sovereignty would substitute for state sovereignty. And that's part of the purpose of the idea that I'm suggesting here. The third quotation is probably in some ways going to be the most controversial, I imagine. This is put forward by Danilo Zollo, an Italian jurist. No one can be under any illusion that the greatest world powers are likely to wish to sit at the same table as the poorest and weakest countries in order to take part in a democratic decision-making process involving equality of votes over decisions regarding vital military and economic questions and the strategic balance of the planet. Unfortunately, this assumption, which he calls an illusion, I think is often an assumption that's made by advocates of certain versions of global justice. And yet, the notion of global governance, to which Zollo indirectly refers, requires just such a political process to occur, to take place. No such process has taken place. All global institutions are funded and controlled by powerful hegemonic powers, as most of you know. And moreover, there's nothing in the near future or the far future, as I can see, that would change that fact. And so this is not to make any kind of criticism of the notions of international law as an accommodation between independent sovereign powers. That's an important feature of global ethics. But it is to challenge the idea that we can replace states once they are no longer regarded, as Rawls suggests, as legitimate sovereign entities with global governance institutions more generally. That's, of course, much too little to say about this, but time is running out, so I want to move forward. Perhaps we can talk about that, the reasons why more afterwards. Third, I quote this perhaps not well-known statement by Lewis Mumford from the 1930s. It's highly important to recognize the basic regional and economic realities that have been ignored by the mythology of the national state, with its egoistic schemes of conquest, dominion, and belligerent assertion. Of course, he wrote this in 1938, which is a trying time for those affected by national states. But it does not only apply to the 1930s, but in fact to, I think, the project of trying to base sovereignty and legitimacy and self-determination of peoples on a national identity. I've written quite a bit about this elsewhere. I'm not going to rehearse it, but I would say that national identities, as a general matter, tend to fragment and divide the regions and peoples and countries that in fact need enough unity to develop, sustain, and protect their own ecosystems. Two examples, just to mention them. One is Eastern Europe. The fragmentation of East European states, at least half a dozen new states have been created in the last generation, has coincided with a catastrophic decline in living standards and development across that region. This is not the first time this has happened. It happened after World War I with the dissolution of the Habsburg Empire, one of the most rapidly developing states in the world at that time. And several generations have followed with increasing fragmentation and division, increasing poverty and hardship. Second example, need I say, the Near East. All of the countries in the Near East, whether Arab, Jewish, or otherwise, are dependent on water resources. The boundaries cut across the water resources required to sustain life in this region, and the fights inevitably are going to be about those. If there's no ability, political or other context, to unite these countries, development will not ensue, the region will exhaust its resources, and so nothing remotely considering a peace of global justice can be achieved under those circumstances. The nation state, in short, is not the appropriate venue. But I will say that one good thing about the notion of national identity is it, as it were, goes in the right direction. We are not looking for the appropriate political agency, as it were, above the state, but rather, so to speak, below it. And below it is not only, as Mumford points out, national identities, but also ecological realities of how people actually act to sustain their life and their livelihood. And that brings me then to the last quotation, which I'll make a couple of brief comments about in this talk. Robin Eckersley in 2004 writes, "The territorial dimension of sovereignty might be made to work for the environment insofar as it might enable political communities to resist certain aspects of economic globalization or to censure and possibly halt practices in other states that threaten to undermine domestic ecosystem integrity." I see the notion of eco-sovereignty as as engaged in this project in three ways, very quickly. First, it enables communities oriented around regions to resist globalization, to resist primitive accumulation, to protect people and to keep them on their lands. And as P said this evening, that is ultimately the most important thing, to keep people on their lands and in their territories. The reason suicide rates are high is because a substantial number of them actually consider death preferable to leaving their homelands and their territories. I think we need to orient our notions of global justice around that fact. Secondly, such a notion can mandate responsible state behavior to preserve ecosystems that sustain life. It does this by providing a principle of legitimacy. Their authority ought to be derived from the fact of whether they do this or not, whether they act to preserve sustainable environments or not. It is not currently so oriented, but I'm arguing that it should be. Finally, such a principle should influence other states to halt environmentally destructive practices. This is perhaps for climate change, the one point at which I touch upon the issue of climate change. We need to revisit the notion of states as actors that can engage in fight back, in coercive practices to end not only exploitation and capital accumulation, but also the destruction of the environment in various sorts of ways. I can speak about that more if we have time. I'm going to stop here. I think the concept of eco-sovereignty can generate certain types of policy proposals, and I think it also, by the way, and this is important to me especially, connect up to ongoing political movements today. And I think in some ways it's an attempt to bundle a number of these movements and find a means of providing justifications and arguments for them. And we can talk about more about that perhaps in questions. Thank you.
So thank you, Omar. We have time for 2 or 3 questions. 1 and 2, and then we'll see where we go. And behind. Okay, so.
Is that adequate where I put the mic? Okay, thank you very much. That was quite provocative. And I've been provoked in 3 ways. So I want to start with your definition of a people. Just tell me if I've got this wrong. A group of persons with a distinct relationship to the environment, or an environment. Do I understand that? Okay. So this strikes me as a political, dynamic, relational understanding, but that those politics and those relations don't actually go in the same directions all the time. So one dimension is boundaries. The boundary of that relational group might vary. Its effects, that is, sometimes not everybody in the entity has the same control over that environment. In fact, many of the people affecting that environment might be outside of it. And then the third might be that there are differences within those environments about how people are experiencing, just to be crass, some are winners and losers in that environmental struggle. So that's my first comment. My second one relates to that. I think you could look at the same thing that I've asked you. You sort of threw away the concept of recognition. But what exactly is supposed to be recognized about that entity if the dynamics of that entity are moving in those ways? That is, there's a politics around the definition of the border. There's a politics around the effects coming from outside. And there's a politics around the dynamics within those. seems to me that that would affect the politics of recognition of that group. And third, you seem quite clear, particularly at the end, that this is absolutely a fighting creed. And this is a fighting creed, right? We're supposed to use this idea of eco-sovereignty to defend our rights, to assert our rights. And if I listen to politics globally, I certainly have many examples of representatives of state actors absolutely treating it as a fighting creed. I would like some indication of how this is supposed to be a fighting creed for justice, because given those three forms of politics around the formation of that eco-sovereign entity, and as I've just pointed out, I think that's quite dynamic, the politics are actually about that, and it could very well be that this fighting creed is being used by elites, and that others are quite the losers in that fight.
Okay, thank you for your question. What you've done is to highlight some of the ambiguities in the concept, and I don't want to pretend that I've eliminated them. I think that the notion, defining what philosophers call external sovereignty rights, which is what I'm talking about, the relation of communities to those outside, does not necessarily answer a number of questions about internal sovereignty. That is the relation between peoples and their states, the kind of thing that Rawls is addressing here in a certain sort of way. And that is not something that can be briefly addressed or even necessarily incorporated in this idea. So a constitutional arrangement that is fair to the people for whom this concept should be of service is not necessarily specific to this idea, but certainly an undemocratic regime or a regime tied to an elite. I suppose the question is, could they use this notion of eco-sovereignty in another sort of way? Now, Eckersley writes about that a bit by saying that elites have traditionally used sovereignty as a way to restrict access to resources and to monopolize their own access to resources. And she suggests that that, of course, could happen, but it's not the only thing that could happen. In fact, resources could be used to address other concerns than those of capital accumulation. What will make the difference is very much a matter of the democratization of the internal constitution of a given people and a given state. And that problem is not unique to my conception of sovereignty. In fact, it's a general political matter for all attempts to define the extent of a state or a political community. The other thing that I would say about border definitions is that that's a very complex question which involves issues that I haven't touched on here. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to introduce an additional consideration that I think is important enough to trump other ways of defining boundaries. For instance, national identities being, I think, should be subsidiary to such a principle of eco-sovereignty. That doesn't mean that everything else is, no other consideration is relevant. Of course, there are others. And developing this as a full-fledged set of criteria for determining boundaries and borders is a worthy project and something that I hope to work out or flesh out if the concept seems worthwhile going forward. But I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I would just say that I'm introducing a consideration that I think has been ignored, and how that is compatible with others is yet to be determined.
And I'm afraid we have time for only one more question.
Few short observations. Thanks for the insightful, presentation. But thanks for highlighting what political justice, global justice theorists and philosophers have, felt in doing that. Let me put in the question form. Do you have any alternative and the better institutional design reconciling the global claims of justice with local autonomy, resulting into better and robust idea of political agency that you claim? Secondly, what I see, the way I look at the paper, it's a kind of contesting imagination of sovereignty and justice. And this is my personal view, and I feel emphasizing too much on the national put it like that, self-determination and local autonomy could also go against the very notion or the conception of global justice over the period of time. Reason that the locally autonomous region may turn to be in such a way that they are not ready to accept an even better globally, presented model. So it's a kind of, class of sovereignty. In that way, we are hung up in the contestation between what local imagination is or are and what global imagination is and are, or what local imagination is and are. So in that way, this contestation will be really harmful for the, the global collective action, you say, or the global realization of justice as well. Thank you.
Okay, I take it these are two separate questions, and I think I got the first a little bit better than the second, but in terms of, I think you asked about institutional design and what might follow from such an idea, which is exactly what I did not talk about. I have two ideas particularly. I think eco-sovereignty should generally be instituted by one of the following policies. On the one hand, federation, and by federation I mean federation of existing states in larger collections. The two examples I spoke about in Eastern Europe and the Near East, I think, are good examples of this. I did not, however, use the EU as an example of it. That's another, I guess that's another debate. I don't think that that's a successful example, but I do think that there are cases of that. And the second is applied more to hegemonic and large states. I certainly would apply it to the United States and to the EU to the extent that you think of it as a state, and that is what I call devolution. The devolution of authority, which would be greater local autonomy under conditions in which a large state is actually favoring one region over another, or favoring an elite which is tied to the state rather than local peoples. Whether this conception applies to India, I personally think it probably does, but I leave it to you to decide about that. But I think it would apply to a number of large states globally. The cumulative effect of both of these would, I think, over time be to equalize the global power structure a bit. I'm not under an illusion that this is any absolute solution, but I think that by weakening hegemonic states, even regionally hegemonic states such as China or India, and by strengthening smaller ones, by pooling their resources, federating them in a way that provides them the ability to sustain their own economic systems and circuits of production, I think that over time that will have an international effect. Maybe that's all I have time for. Perhaps I can address your other question later.
So let's thank Omar for his very interesting discussion.